The Elim Church in Dewsbury commenced on the 11th of April 1953 with an evangelistic mission led by three men called Reverend Gardiner from Halifax, Elim, Reverend Lambert from Sowerbury Bridge, Elim, and Reverend J.J. Morgan from Bradford, Elim, who was also the president of the Elim churches. The event took place in the large hall in the Liberal Rooms in Bond Street, and the Dewsbury Reporter reported on the campaign, recording several hundred local people attending during that week's mission. For the next 6 years, this mission was carried on by those three ministers until the 25th of November 1959, when the church finally moved into its first building on Swindon Road. This was under the leadership of Pastor David Hathaway, who carried on leading the church until late 1965.
In September 1965, Graham Knight became the new pastor, and he stayed for 5 years. It was recorded during that time that Graham's son, Gareth, became seriously ill and he was taken to hospital one Sunday afternoon. He wasn't given long to live, and so in the evening service that day, the church gathered together and they prayed for his healing. And during that evening at 7 o'clock, the doctor actually declared a miracle had taken place. Gareth had been healed. By May 1971, George Miller, who had become a Christian at Dewsbury Elim in 1964, he came back from Bible college to serve as the pastor in Dewsbury Elim for 3 years until moving to Guyana with his wife Hazel and his children. From 1974 until 1977, the church was pastored by Reverend White, moving from Cornwall to Dewsbury. And by May 1977, Tony Couchy left Malta with his wife Elizabeth to serve as pastor for 5 years.
Towards the end of 1981, the church was shaken to its core when the leadership and the majority of the membership left Elim. And by the 5th of February 1982, Pastors Tony Couchy and Pastor Bill Ramsey from the Church of the Nazarene joined together to form a new church that gathered in the town hall, leaving Dewsbury Elim with only 4 women: Joan Shaw, Margaret Thomason, Doris Usher and Madge Crabtree, who refused to believe that God was finished with Dewsbury Elim. Although they were encouraged by Elim leadership to join other local churches, they decided to stay and to pray. What would happen to Dewsbury Elim Church? Would it survive? Did it have a future?
"29 years had passed since Elim, by God's grace, started its mission of sharing the gospel and making disciples throughout Dewsbury. Like in Gareth's story, the newspapers said that the Elim church was seriously ill and was not given long to live. And it was by the prayer of those 4 women who refused to leave and believed that God would indeed prove himself to be the God of the resurrection, that on the 12th of February 1982, a crusade by George Wallace and David Hudson came to this very small church and began pioneering again. Throughout the next 14 years, as David Hudson led the church, hundreds heard about Jesus' love for them. In October 1996, after pastoring in Cumbria, Paul Hudson, David's son, came back to the church as the pastor.
Under Paul's leadership, the church continued to grow both in number and in love for God and one another. There was a sense of fun and family as people shared their lives with one another, enjoying the presence of God amongst them. There was a growth in prayer and fasting as the church joined together to seek the face of God through some extremely challenging times. When God led Dewsbury Elim to our current building on Daisy Hill, it was a season of growth in the life of the church. The previous building on Swindon Road was just too small. What had once been a great blessing from God had become a limit upon what God was doing. On March the 11th, 2000, Dewsbury Elim moved into the building on Daisy Hill. At that commissioning service, the church joined together to pray a powerful prayer.
Let your glory and power fall upon us as we gather in this building. Let the fragrance of your presence be known in our worship. We desire that the Holy Spirit has freedom to move as he chooses. We call upon you for salvation. We call upon you for healings. We call upon you for signs and wonders. May your kingdom come and your will be done.
Over the next 10 years, Elim shared the building with the Methodist Church, arriving on Sunday mornings after the Methodist service was finished and quickly setting up all of Elim's equipment ready for our service. By the grace of God and through the generous giving of the church, Elim eventually bought the building from the Methodist Church and moved in full time. While there was a lot of work to be done practically to renovate the building and make it fit for the future, there was also new life taking place. New ministries were born, people were saved and baptized. God showed himself to be faithful.
One of the key markers of this period of time when Paul Hudson was the pastor was the journey the church took in exploring whole life discipleship. Working with the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity, the church began to examine what it is to be a whole life disciple making church as part of a pilot project LICC was running. Paul Hudson reflected that there'd been a disconnect between what was happening in the building on a Sunday and what was happening in people's lives throughout the week. Through the Imagine project, people in the church began to be commissioned to go into their places of work, their schools, their communities, and see those places as their front line, where they'd been sent by God as missionaries. In 2012, Paul Hudson left Dewsbury Elim to take up the post of International Missions Director at Elim Missions, and Marcus Bennett came from Wimbledon to be the pastor. Marcus and Sue stayed until 2018. Pastor Nicky Wilkinson, who'd been serving as an MIT, led the church through a short interregnum with support from Bridge Community Church in Leeds until April 2019, when Jack and I came to be pastors.
The world and the church were rocked in March 2020 when the rumour of a new virus called COVID-19 led to a nationwide lockdown. Overnight, all the activities of the church had to stop or be moved online. Nobody knew how long this would last for or what it would mean for the future of the church. Pastors learned to preach to a camera instead of a room full of people. Musicians learned to record their parts remotely in their homes. We all became accustomed to tuning into YouTube every Sunday morning. Everybody learned to access Zoom. Some even took their first steps into the world of social media. It was a time of isolation for many people, but also a time when people came together in ways they previously hadn't. We saw families welcoming single people into their bubbles, people reaching out to their neighbours to offer support, prayer and hope, and teams of people out on the street outside the church building serving food to the vulnerable people in our town. It was also a time of deep reflection where we asked ourselves big questions and also asked those questions of God. What is church when we can't meet together? What lessons did God want us to learn from this period of time? What kind of church would emerge from the pandemic?
One of the things that was impressed upon us particularly was the desire to move forward and not go back to how things were before. In some ways we did settle back into our old patterns after lockdown. Even so, it was a real joy to be able to come together again after over a year of being exclusively online, even with restrictions still in place. We came back together for the first time on Sunday the 25th of July 2021, after a trial period of running some small services on alternate Sunday evenings. Bill blew the shofar and we lifted up a shout of praise to usher in a new season in the life of the church. It was some time before we were able to be fully free of distancing and masks, but we persevered through that time and God was with us. The church looks very different now than it did before the pandemic. We've been through a season of recovery, but have also seen fresh life beginning to show in the form of new families joining us and new ministries beginning to grow, like the community cinema, flourish, and our partnership with Zarak being established.
In the last 70 years, God has moved powerfully through Elim in Dewsbury. People have been saved, baptised, healed, set free, commissioned to ministry in new areas, even sent overseas as missionaries.
Our history has been marked by signs and wonders, discipleship, a sense of family, and the presence of God guiding and sustaining His church through the dark times.
Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." As we move forward into the future, we walk in step with the Spirit who is leading us, making disciples of Christ, baptizing and teaching them to obey everything He has taught us. And we know that He will be with us even to the end of the age.
God is calling us to once again be a family of disciples who make disciples, embodying our core values, loving God, loving our family, and loving Dewsbury and beyond.
Loving God,
Loving God,
loving our
loving our
family.
family,
Loving God, loving
loving
our
our family,
Loving our family.
loving Dewsbury and beyond.